Kristen Stratton, and NorCal has invited me to be a guest presenter for the last of our 4-part series about IEPs. Today's topic is about IEP goal writing. And just briefly, if you haven't had an opportunity to attend before, I am a special education advocate and the parent of 3 children. I have a daughter who's hearing, who is on the autism spectrum. I have 2 sons who are deaf, one of whom uses spoken language and sign language. And then I have another son who's deaf with multiple disabilities, and he uses sign language and assistive technology to communicate. And I am also a hard of hearing adult myself. Okay, let's jump right into our slideshow. Okay, so we're gonna be discussing the IEP goal writing process, which is part of the IDEA law, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is part of an IEP, an Individualized Education Plan. That's going to be developed with your LEA, your local education agency, which is usually your school district where you reside. And the goal of an IEP is for a student to receive an education in what's called their Least Restrictive Environment, or their LRE. Hopefully, if you've attended our other presentations, and all of these are familiar terms to you, but these are some of the things that you might hear me say today. And the goal of an IEP is to ensure a student's right to a FAPE, or a free and appropriate public education. And we're primarily talking about the deaf plus population today, and that would be deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind individuals who may have or who are known to have developmental delays or disabilities. So IDEA, what's the point? So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was developed to ensure that a student's right to an appropriate education was protected. So students with disabilities are going to receive special education and related services in the least restrictive environment possible. And this law was developed in order to protect their right to a free and appropriate public education. So that is the point of this law. And so how do we make sure that that's happening? Well, that's the point of an IEP goal. So one of the stated purposes of IDEA is to prepare students for further education, employment, and independent living. And I think very often that objective gets forgotten because we get so caught up in the year-to-year process of writing an IEP that very often we forget that the entire purpose of public education is to prepare students for life as adults. So when we're writing IEP goals and we're educating students, the ultimate goal is always to think about how are we preparing this student to either attend technical school or community college, maybe a 4-year private or public university. Are they going to go straight into employment when they graduate high school, or prepare them to live independently as possible with their individual disability and needs in mind, of course. So this is how we build an IEP. It is built very systematically. We always start with where the student is performing and work our way up towards the ultimate goal of offering them a free and appropriate public education with all of the supports and services in place. But the only way that we can make sure that that student is making progress is through goals. Goals really are how we monitor progress and make sure that that student is receiving their free and appropriate public education. Goals are the essential building blocks for offering a student their FAPE. So how did we determine that that was a necessary component of an IEP? Well, there's some legal history to this. Back in the 1980s, there was a very significant Supreme Court decision called the Rowley decision, and that actually involved a student who was deaf. Amy Rowley was the student's name, and she was a deaf first grader. And she was primarily using lip reading as a means of accessing her education. She was in a mainstream school, which means that she was not in a deaf school or in a school where people were using sign language. She was in a school where they were using spoken language, and that was the means of how she was receiving her education. Her parents requested on her behalf that she receive a sign language interpreter, and the school denied that request. And through various legal battles, this worked its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And believe it or not, the Supreme Court actually decided that that request for an interpreter was not necessary. This court decision predates the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the right to an interpreter and effective communication and all the things that we understand now did not exist at the time of the Rowley decision. And the court's rationale at the time was Amy Rowley is a really bright student. She is making grade to grade progress. She's going through school every year. She's making the marks that we expect a fully included general education student to make. And therefore, she does not need more accommodations. We're not expected to give her every single support and service that the parents want or that the student asks for just because they have a disability. That's not what's required based on how we're interpreting the law. So later, when the Supreme Court overturned that decision in 2017, the Supreme Court said that was called a de minimis standard, which was considered hardly an education at all. So to do the bare minimum for a student was then to be considered hardly an education at all. So in 2017, there was another landmark decision called the Andrew F. decision. And that is the standard that we now use to interpret whether or not a student is getting an appropriate education. So now when a student is fully included and they are in a general education setting, the standard is that they have goals that are appropriately ambitious, meaning they are expected to be doing grade level work and have the appropriate services in place to enable them to do things with their typical peers. So the standard is now that the IEP be reasonably calculated to enable this child to make progress that is appropriate in light of their circumstances. Now, again, this is considering a student that is included. When talking about a child that is in a separate setting, the Supreme Court said that for students who are in separate setting classrooms or alternative curriculum settings, that the IEP team needs to consider that child's unique circumstances, and that the IEP team needs to write an IEP that is considering their academic and functional advancement. So the standard is a little bit different. But in either circumstance, the IEP team needs to provide a cogent and responsive explanation for their decisions. What does that mean? The Supreme Court said, if you're writing this IEP and you're offering this placement for this student, and these supports and services for this student, you need to defend why that was an appropriate offer. And the best way to do that is data. So that's where IEP goals come in. IEP goals are measurable ways that we say this student is making progress that is reasonably calculated in light of that child's circumstances or is unique. We've considered the child's unique circumstances and are addressing their academic and functional advancement needs. So that is why IEP goals are an essential part of ensuring a child's FAPE. Okay, we're ready. Okay, so when we're talking about goals, we're talking about our present levels, which is where the student is at now. And we're talking about where we want the child to be in 1 year, which is our IEP goal. The area of need is where the child is identified as needing help, and we should have objective data. That's something we can measure. And we want something that says, okay, I want a percentage, I want a number, I want something that I can look at and say, okay, this is my starting point for this child in my present level. And on the end of that year, I want to say that I addressed that area of need. I want to say that I have the objective data that supports that I addressed that same area of need and that student had some measurable progress. IEP goals should always match the present level, the area of need, and how we measure it. Everything should match from the beginning of the year to the end of the year in terms of how we are measuring progress. So let's start with our first example. So our present level in our IEP is the following. William is a 5-year-old boy who is deaf and has cerebral palsy. So deaf CP, that's what that means. He's in kindergarten. Right now, he is able to receptively, that means understand with his eyes, identify 16 out of 26 letters of American Sign Language alphabet. He struggles to identify several of the letters, P, Q, M, N, T, S, A, X, K, and E. Now, when I look at IEPs, I want to see all of that information. Very often I'll look at an IEP present level and it'll say things like, William struggles to identify 16 out of 26 letters, but it won't tell me which ones they're struggling to identify. Or it'll say he can identify 16 out of 26, but I don't know which ones he cannot identify. So we need to have objective data. I need to know where the strengths lie and where the areas of need are, and we need to have that data. So our identified area of need is receptive language, but it can also be literacy. It really depends on the setting and how we're going to address this goal. And our IEP goal is going to be, where do we want William to be in a year? Now, considering that this is a kindergarten student and they're 5 years old and we're still working on letter identification, it's very possible that the trajectory of this student is that we're still going to be working on letter identification at the end of a year's time, and that's okay. We're going to consider that child's progress and write something that's appropriate in light of their circumstances. Okay, all right, so now for our annual goal. So again, we have the same present level. Now we are going to use that present level to establish our goal baseline. When we look at an IEP, we always have two components. We have our present level that then becomes the baseline or our starting point for our annual goal. And then we take that same area of need and that same way we measured that child's present level, and we take that and we write an annual goal. Where do we want that student to be in 1 year based on whether or not they're in general education or in a separate setting? We want it to be ambitious. We want it to be reasonably calculated. And we want to make sure that we're addressing that appropriate area of need. And we're not writing a goal for something completely different than what the area of need is, because I definitely see that happen. So here we have our goal baseline. When an ASL letter is signed to him, William can receptively identify, again, understand with his eyes, the correct letter by selecting the corresponding ASL letter in print from a field of 3 with 60% accuracy across 5 trials. Now, if you are a parent and you've never been in an an IEP meeting before, that might sound very confusing to you. So let me break it down and explain what that looks like in the classroom setting. That means your child's going to get pulled aside for goal work. They're going to put 3 cards in front of your child. Each of those cards is going to have an ASL letter on it. And they're going to sign a letter to your child and then ask your child to match on one of those 3 cards which letter was signed to them. And your child's going to point to which correct card was signed. That's what receptive identification is. We do that for a lot of children who have fine motor deficits. Again, William is a student with cerebral palsy. So we're going to assume that sometimes it's difficult for him to produce manually with his hands a ASL letter, but we're not going to assume that that doesn't mean he doesn't understand something. So we're going to then determine how we're going to write this into an annual goal. So November 16th, 2024, after being shown an ASL letter signed to him, William will demonstrate knowledge of all 26 ASL letters. So that's my goal next year. I want him to have made progress. I want him to know all 26 letters by the end of the year. By receptively identifying, so we're measuring the same way, the correct corresponding letter from a field of 3. Again, we're measuring the same way. We tested by measuring from a field of 3, and we're going to test again at the end of the year by measuring from a field of 3 cards. And this time, I want him to get 100% accuracy. And across 5 trials means that I'm going to test him 5 times. It doesn't mean we're only going to work on it 5 times. That means that I'm going to do formal data collection where I'm checking in progress at least 5 times, that's where I'm going to formally do progress reporting throughout the year. Okay, so when you're in an IEP meeting and you're developing IEP goals, and from a parent perspective, let's assume that this is all very new and overwhelming to you. You have the opportunity to ask all of these WH questions, and I encourage you to do so whether it's your first IEP meeting or your 100th IEP meeting. And the reason is, I think a lot of IEP team members are incredibly busy. A lot of times, even the most experienced and wonderful case carriers and teachers are putting together IEPs very, very quickly. And sometimes they don't necessarily put all the thought that they could have into IEP goal development because they are overwhelmed with caseloads. So I like to pause and ask these questions when I don't fully understand how a goal was developed or why a goal was developed. So I like to say, who is supporting this goal? Is it the speech pathologist? Is it the deaf and hard of hearing teacher? Is it the special education teacher? Is it the occupational therapist? Is it a combination of multiple people? What are we measuring? Are we measuring increasing a skill? Are we measuring decreasing a behavior? Sometimes we're measuring so many things that at the end of the year, that child is not going to meet that goal because we're trying to measure 6 different things and it's impossible to implement that goal. When is my child going to work on this? Because that's going to determine what kind of placement your child's going to be in, what service that child's going to get. So that's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. Where is my child going to work on this goal? That's something to really consider, because if you're concerned about where your child's going to be placed, or what kind of service providers they need to be working with in order to make progress on that goal, that's a really important question that you should be asking your team, or definitely at least asking yourself in the back of your mind when you're going through an IEP. Why does my child need to be working on this goal? Honestly, not all goals are necessary. And sometimes goals are time wasters. Sometimes I will open up an IEP and a child has 25 goals, and that's an impossible IEP to implement. We need to always ask ourselves, why are we working on this goal? Is it truly necessary for this child? Or can we pare down this IEP and focus on what's truly necessary for this child to receive their free and appropriate public education? And how are we measuring progress? Again, where is my data? Where are my numbers? Am I doing percentage points? Am I measuring by trials? I want to see something measurable. Goals drive placement and services. If your goals are a mess, you will not have an easy conversation with your IEP team about where your child should be placed and what their services should be. I have so many parents call me and say, well, I want to get more speech services for my child, or I want my child to be in general education more often. And one of the first questions I ask is, what kind of goals do they have? Are they making progress on their goals? What did the last progress report say? And more often than not, the answer to those questions are, I don't know. It's really important that you know what goals are in your child's IEP. So back to our little William. And in full transparency, William is my son. So I'm not using anybody else's kid, just my own. So back to William. Let's break down William's goal again with those WH questions in mind. And I want you guys to think it through, and we'll actually go through the answers together. So by November 16th, 2024, after being shown an ASL letter signed to him, William will demonstrate knowledge of all 26 letters by receptively identifying the correct corresponding letter from a field of 3 with 100% accuracy across 5 trials. So I want you to ask yourself, assuming what we know about William, William is a student with cerebral palsy. William is a student who's deaf. And I'll also let you in that William is a student who's in a mainstream program. He does not have he's not in a deaf school. He's in a hearing program with an ASL interpreter and a deaf and hard of hearing itinerant teacher. So who should be supporting this goal? What are we measuring in this goal? When is he working on this goal? Where would he be working on this goal? And this student at this time was in both general education and receiving special education. Why would we be working on this goal? And how are we measuring the progress? So think about that, and we'll go through that together in a little bit. Okay, so this is an example of what a IEP goal would look like. This is from a program called SEIS, S-E-I-S. There's a lot of different software programs that are used in our state of California. So this is just one of many formats that you might see. Your school district might use an entirely different format, but the content is always going to be the same. So what's included in the IEP goal is always going to be the same, even if the appearance is different. So in the red box to your left, there's the area of need. And so we would put, receptive language, the baseline, that information that we had about how William's performing right now. He knows those 16 out of 26 ASL letters when they're presented receptively. That would be our baseline. And then to the right of that, we have our green box. That's where we're going to put our annual goal. You'll see we have an annual goal number. So we're going to have a variety of goals in the IEP. All of them are going to be numbered. And then it says by. We're going to put the date. So we're going to have every date differently depending on when your child's IEP was established. But that annual date is going to usually be within 1 year of when your IEP team develops this IEP. And then we're going to talk about as measured by. That's going to be that data that we're going to collect. And then you'll see there's several boxes beneath it that give several options about why it is we're writing this goal. That's our WH question, our why are we doing this goal? That's what those sections are referring to. It's enabling the student to make progress in the general education setting. And if that is the case, there will always be a state standard that's listed there if a student is working on a general education academic goal. If the goal is addressing other educational needs, maybe it's a vocational skill, such as them working on taking care of their own backpack or their own organizational skills. Linguistically appropriate, those would be more language related goals, and transition goals are things that we would typically see in a student that's 16 years or older. And then we have our persons responsible. That's our who of our WH. It's going to list who is collecting this data, who is going to be tasked with overseeing the implementation of this goal. Okay, so this is just a more zoomed in version of that section so you can see it more clearly. But I think that it's pretty well explained, but we can probably go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next part of an IEP goal would potentially be short-term objectives. Now, not all goals are going to utilize short-term objectives. There are two circumstances where I see this, one of which is when it's required. In California, if we have a student who's in an alternative curriculum or a functional life skills program, such as a moderate severe classroom, that is a required part of the IEP, where we're going to set short-term objectives where we're going to check in at set intervals throughout that annual IEP year and make sure that that student is making progress on their goal. However, there are some IEP teams who are required by policy to do short-term objectives just within their own local educational agency. They're required to do that. And then there's sometimes that we just write more intricate or complex goals where it makes sense to write benchmarks or short-term objectives. And that can be an IEP team decision. But the only time it's truly required by law is when we have a student in an alternative curriculum program. Okay, so here we have an actual example of a goal. And this would be an example of what not to do. And in true transparency, this was actually a draft IEP. So I'm not here to throw a teacher under the bus. This was a draft IEP that was presented to me, and so it wasn't completely filled out. But I do receive final copies from clients who are reaching out to me for assistance and have signed consent to IEPs that do look like this. So here we have a completed area of need, and it says language development through literature. There is no baseline. I do see this in final copies of IEPs that are signed where we have no data, no information in the baseline whatsoever. And that's problematic because I don't have a starting reference point for where that child was. And therefore, how do I know if they made adequate progress in 1 year's time? It's impossible for me to know that. And then here at the bottom, you will see that there are short-term objectives filled out. That's actually a good example of how to do short-term objectives. If you can see in the short-term objectives 1, 2, and 3, they all have different measurements. So short-term objective 1 says, given exposure to ASL classifiers in English literature, William will demonstrate receptive understanding of 2 classifiers with 80% accuracy. You don't have to understand what all of that means if all of this is new to you. What I want to point out is if you look to the very far right of those, you'll see that the difference in the numbers. In objective 1, there's 2 classifiers that will be identified. In the second objective, it's 4 classifiers. And then the last objective, there's 6 classifiers, and that's actually our annual goal. So those objectives are making sure that we're going to make sure that we're on track to hit our goal. Okay. Here's another example of what not to do. And again, I'm not trying to, okay, we switched to interpreters. Okay, so here's another example of what not to do. And again, I'm not trying to throw any teacher under the bus. Teachers are incredibly overwhelmed and busy. And so we always seek to work collaboratively with our IEP teams. So what I suggest is to ask for a draft copy of your student's IEP prior to your student's IEP meeting, so that you get an opportunity to look for anything that might need editing or that you might have questions about or concerns about or comments about, so that you give your team an opportunity to maybe ensure that they have data or the opportunity to answer those questions or address those concerns, so that you guys can work collaboratively as a team for the benefit of your student. It should not be a chance to catch someone in a mistake or aha, gotcha. You know, that shouldn't be your objective in requesting an IEP draft. The goal should be to work collaboratively as a team. So here in our baseline, you'll see it says William can complete 2 items within a task and then participate in a preferred task. And then in our IEP goal, we have a percent, which is fine. But I don't have a percent in my baseline. So I don't have a reference point to measure progress because I don't have a percent in my baseline to see where he started at. So that would be an example of something that needs to be fixed prior to consenting to the IEP. And so that gives the teacher an opportunity to go and do some data collection so we can make sure that that IEP goal is going to be measurable at the end of the IEP year. The other thing I want to point out here is that persons responsible says special education staff. This happens a lot, and staff does work collaboratively together. We have paraprofessionals or aides in classrooms. We have lots of related service providers, and absolutely everyone works as a team. But the person responsible is someone qualified or credentialed or certificated who actually is qualified to oversee the implementation of this goal and collect data on it. And that is who needs to be primarily listed as the person responsible. There could be multiple people listed on here, such as a deaf and hard of hearing itinerant teacher and a special education teacher if they're working in collaboration to support a goal. That's fine, but it cannot be someone who is not certificated or qualified to instruct or work on a goal, because that's not how we write IEPs. Okay, so back to our WH questions. So maybe you've thought about it now that you've had a chance to see some of the examples. Our who for this goal is going to be actually a collaborative effort. Because we have a student that's deaf, but who is in a mainstream program. Mainstream is in the deaf community considered a hearing program. We're going to work collaboratively with the special education and deaf and hard of hearing teacher to support this goal. The what, we're increasing a skill. We're working on increasing ASL letter identification. When, because this is a academic goal and this is a student who is receiving special education services, it's going to be during the time that student is receiving specialized academic instruction. So that is going to correspond to when that student is receiving that time, and that's going to be listed in their services later in their IEP. Remember, we said that goals drive services. So the fact that we have a special education teacher on this goal means that we are absolutely going to have special education minutes in the IEP. Goals drive services. Where? So this could really be dependent on the goal, but in this situation, the student's going to receive this service in a specialized academic instruction classroom, in a special education classroom. Not necessarily they're going to be in that classroom for the majority of their day. That's going to be based on the totality of the student's goals, whether or not they require being in a separate setting placement. But for this specific goal, it's going to require a pull-out service where that student's going to be removed from special education and working specifically on this goal with their special education and deaf and hard of hearing teacher collaboratively. Now, why it really depends on all of the present levels for the student, but it could either be a literacy goal where we align this goal with a state standard, but we could also call this a receptive language goal. And how we're going to do data. That is our means of measuring progress. We're going to collect data, but we can also put in the goal that we're going to collect student work samples. So now we've talked about how we're going to put a field of 3, but we can do an activity where that student's going to cut out those fields of 3 cards and glue the corresponding correct answer on a worksheet. So student work samples are a great way, especially in elementary or in alternative curriculum settings, where we can demonstrate a student's progress in understanding. Writing is a great opportunity, and mathematics. Those are really good goals where we should have student work samples listed on the goal as a means of collecting data. Okay, so progress monitoring and reports. So again, the whole function of all of our Supreme Court battles was to monitor progress and ensure that student is receiving their free and appropriate public education. So progress monitoring and goals are an essential function of making sure that IEP is working for that student. So IEP progress reports are not just something that you get from their case carrier once in a while and you look at it and go, oh, that's nice. And then you set it aside or you stick it in their IEP binder and there it goes to die. It is really important that you dissect those IEP progress reports. They are required to be given to you. IEP progress reports should be sent out at least as often as general education students receive their progress reports and grades. So if general education students in your district are on a trimester system, you should be getting progress reports at the same interval that their report cards get sent out. Semester system, same interval. Whatever the progress reporting requirements for general education students are in your district, your IEP team should be sending out progress reports for your students' IEP goals at least as often. Now, we as an IEP team can put in the IEP that we're going to do progress reporting more often, and sometimes that's really appropriate, especially if we have goals that are very complex. But at a minimum, it happens at least as often as general education students receive their progress reporting. Progress reports should include data. If your child's progress report does not have data, you need to request an IEP meeting or a records request immediately. That's not supposed to be confrontational. It's not because we're trying to throw teachers under the bus or be unnecessarily difficult. That is required by law. They must be collecting data. And that is the only way that you can ensure your child's IEP is being implemented and that your child's making progress. Because what happens is if you get a progress report and all it says is, Johnny's doing great, keep up the good work, Johnny. And then at the end of the year, all of Johnny's goals did not get met or only partially met or so close but didn't get met. And you're surprised because all year long you heard how well Johnny was doing. Well, that happens a lot. And the remedy to that is to hold your team accountable and to make sure that they're collecting data on their measurable IEP goals. And so you need to make sure that your team is doing what they need to do and that your child is getting their free and appropriate public education. Okay, so again, sorry, interpreters, that's my bad. Okay, so again, this is an example of what a progress report could look like. Your IEP team might use a different format, but the content will always be the same. The progress report is going to show what your child's IEP goal is, and then at the intervals that they're required to report in your school district at a minimum, you're going to get a progress report that shows how your student's performing on that individual IEP goal. And there should be a progress report summary for each goal in the IEP. Okay, so here's an example of what not to do on a progress report. Again, this is not to throw anyone under the bus. IEP teams are incredibly busy and most of them are doing their best, but we as parents can hold them accountable by asking questions if we get an IEP progress report like this. So at the top of this progress report, we can see the IEP goal. It says by 4/8/20, Stephen will identify with 80% accuracy the proper functioning of his personal hearing aids. Okay, so we have a percentage in our goal. In my progress reports, I have 3 progress reports from May of 2019, from October of 2019, from January of 2020, and there is no data in any of them. And so the problem with that is we're going to get to April and they're going to say the student met or didn't meet the goal. And that's going to be a subjective opinion and not based on objective measurable data. So if that happens, don't wait until January when you've had 3 progress reporting periods. The first time you get an IEP progress report with no data, send an email either to that particular service provider or to the case carrier and say, hey, I noticed there's no data. Was that an error? And give them an opportunity to remedy it, unless that's across the board with all the goals, in which case you should call an IEP meeting. Okay, so here we have a beautiful progress report. This is actually a progress report for someone with a, alternative curriculum IEP. So we have progress reports on objective, short-term objectives, as well as their overall IEP goal. So you'll see the summary of progress. It says partial progress, objective 1 through 2 met. And then in the second box, partial progress, objective 3 met. And then below that in the comments, we have percentages in both boxes, both in the first progress reporting period and in the second progress reporting period. Yes, awesome, beautifully done, amazing case carrier. That is how your child's progress report should look. Even if they don't have short-term objectives, if your child's IEP goal has any sort of data collection requirement in it, which it should, unless it's a very unique goal, there should be some sort of measurable data in their progress report. And there should be some sort of explanation as to how your child's doing in that goal. It doesn't have to be, huge paragraphs, but a little bit more than Johnny's doing great. Thumbs up, Johnny. Because we want to see that the teacher is taking the time to explain how that child is progressing through that goal, and that you as a parent can have an opportunity to understand that that child is or is not making progress. If there's no progress across multiple progress reporting periods, or there's regression, call an IEP meeting. Don't wait until the annual to figure out why there was a problem, because sometimes that means there's not enough services, or the service model, meaning how we are implementing a child's service, is not appropriate and something needs to change. Don't wait till the end of the year to finish that or fix it. Okay, so that was a lot of information, but I think you can take away that IEP goals are really, really important. They are the backbone of your child's IEP, and it's really, really important that you don't underestimate their value, and that your input and that your understanding of how they're written really needs to be heavily emphasized and valued during the IEP development process. Very often teams, I know, talk over and under and around parents, and it can feel very overwhelming in that meeting. You as a parent have a right to stop those conversations and say, explain it, break it down for me. I need to understand. So again, remember those WH questions at that IEP goal development time in the meeting. Request that draft IEP in advance. If they say they don't have time, then say, okay, well, then I guess we need to reschedule the meeting for when you do have time to present that draft to me, because I can't participate in the meeting unless I really understand what's going on with my child in the classroom and have the chance to prepare for that meeting. I will take questions if anybody has any, but I really appreciate you taking the time out of your morning to join me today. And if you would like to, we have a QR code that we'll put up on the screen, and we would appreciate your feedback about today's presentation. We welcome your compliments and your constructive criticisms. We also have some parent support groups coming up in 2024 that we will be advertising later, but we have some invited guest speakers. We have Dr. Natasha Cordes, who's a psychologist. We have a BCBA who will be speaking about working with the Deaf Plus population. And then we have a independent facilitator who will be talking about the self-determination program and the person-centered plan development process. So if you want to mark down those dates, that's a great opportunity as well. And if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And I hope all of you have a wonderful day.